future then, what role fashion plays in a post-climate change future. Fashion is part of an industry that is part of our society that is a bigger problem. But also I think fashion is a special kind of waste because it's so personal, and the way we use clothes fluctuates with the everyday needs and the rhythms of life. We can't say the industry needs to stop, but what are we going to wear? Yeah, so I'm Australian. I live in Brisbane on the east coast of Australia. I'm a fashion researcher and teacher, and I teach Pilates as well. My professional background is in the fashion industry, but I've always not liked it that much. And although I studied marketing and I was planning to have a fashion career, I think as I learned more, what I wanted my fashion career to be was not what is typically cultivated in the industry or expected of fashion students. If we're going to talk about place, I wouldn't say I felt very at home in a fashion school or in the fashion industry. As I've gotten older and started working in more academic or research related roles, you can see the industry changing, of course, and now I feel a bit surrounded in an echo chamber of people who believe what I believe, and maybe I'm just so sucked into the whole now that it's, I don't know, then you make your own place and it's hard to know what exactly the pulse of the industry is. But I've been navigating in and out of feeling at home and against fashion. As an Australian, I identify as Australian for sure, but my parents, neither of them were born here. And in Australia, there's some very complicated tensions, especially at the moment. We've just passed January 26th is Australia Day. And I'm saying that in quotations because it's commemorated as the day that Australia was colonized. And it's actually a really awful history that shouldn't be celebrated. And yeah, it gets a bit tense this time of year, thinking about place and rights to land, and doesn't have a treaty with Indigenous populations. And there's a lot of with opinions on it, but yeah, it's complicated. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I definitely would like to get into that maybe a little bit later. I'd also be curious to hear what made you be interested in the fashion industry in the first place. Were you always interested in, or what's your passion about that?
Yeah, I think I would say I've always been interested in fashion. My mum was a dressmaker, and so I was around someone, and actually my grandmother too, and I've had a lot of, especially women in my family, go into this field, and I have also a close cousin who has too. Maybe just because it was there, but I think also I have always been pretty creative, but not necessarily, I would say creative with my hands, but I think fashion requires a certain type of pattern making discipline that I just never had. And so even though I loved fashion, a big reason why I actually studied fashion communication, not design. So an odd path for, there's not many undergrad degrees that are only communication like mine was. So maybe I have had a very different fashion education to a lot of other fashion students, where they go through this really artisanal and really physical job of design. So yeah, I don't know. I couldn't say there's one particular point. I've just always been creative. I've always enjoyed it. I think fashion is also a very feminized field. So you could say that maybe I was a bit socialized, or who knows, maybe into that deeper. But yeah, I have always enjoyed it. And not only in a creative and aesthetic sense, but what I really enjoy about fashion is that everybody wears it. And I think that fact is such a kind of truism to say, but it is actually something that does connect us, and it is as ordinary as that. I think I was never really interested in the spectacle or the glamour of fashion. Of course, when I was young, probably a little, but I'm more interested in ordinary clothes and people.
Thank you. I'd also be interested, we're definitely going to also go into the more, let's say, dark part of the fashion industry. I'd also be curious, in your fashion degree, was that a part you actively learned about, or did you study that yourself mostly?
Yeah, I would say it's fairly prominent. I think it's very well known that the fashion industry is not sustainable or ethical. And I actually learned that not even at uni, it was in high school doing home economics. I learned that. So, and I think young people, like people in high school today, would probably learn about it through social media. So I think I don't think necessarily that the fact that fashion is not that good is hidden behind a university. I think that's pretty general knowledge now.
Yeah.
But I also wouldn't say that my uni hid it either. We had specific subjects about sustainability in particular, and also on labor that kind of encompass labor stuff. I definitely think there could have been more. And it also does depend on the tutor. Like now I teach some of the subjects that I did, and I will always bring it in, and I make little activists of my students. So it does depend on the teacher for sure.
And if you would like to give, I'm studying ecological design thinking, and quite a lot of our time is exploring the interconnections between the huge challenges we face on a global level currently, be that climate change, biodiversity loss, inequality, increasing conflict, and so on. And I'd be really curious to hear, what is the role of fashion in that? What is the role of fashion in these global challenges and in this inequality? That's just vast.
Do you mean what role did fashion play in causing it, or for the future?
You can maybe start with the past, the present, and also go into the future.
I think fashion has played a huge role as a byproduct of capitalism, and probably critiques it could be placed on other industries. So I think in one sense, fashion is just it's an industry that is part of our society that is the bigger problem. But also I think fashion is a special kind of waste, especially, but also a special kind of injustice. And maybe I can do those three things separately. So it's a special kind of waste because it's so personal, and the way we use clothes it just fluctuates with the everyday needs of life and the rhythms of life. You can be as zero waste as you want, but if your body changes, if you fall pregnant, you're going to need to buy something new, or you're not going to fit something, or you work a laborious job and you get holes in your clothes. This is just having fashion waste isn't necessarily some symptom of capitalism. It's just a symptom of living and life, and all waste could be that way too. So there's this intimate relationship we have with fashion waste. And for example, actually not long ago, or 2 weeks ago, I was looking at a museum archive. Okay, so after World War II, I think this was in the UK, they put out rations for clothing. And so you had to get a ticket to go and buy a piece of clothing. And I was looking into it as a potential kind of thought bubble for a degrowth future for fashion, where you're only designated as your clothing things are rationed. And of course, you would have to think about, would a family with more kids would get more rations, or if you worked a hard job that ripped your clothes a lot, you'd get more rations. Or there would obviously be so many more layers to it than I could even think of right now. But I was looking at, so the archive had the rations, and then they had people's complaints about the rations. And there was just, all the complaints were just like, we need more trousers. My son's growing too fast. We need, you can't put a ration on socks. We need dry, clean socks to be healthy. So it just reminded me that humans need clothes. And so then, if just to allude to the future, then what role fashion plays in a post-climate change future, hopefully, that we have, it dresses humans. We can't be all anti-fashion. We can't say industry needs to stop, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but what are we going to wear? It plays not, and I'm speaking maybe in very functional terms now, but it does play a functional, physical, healthy, and safety role for us. And then, of course, you could think about how it plays roles in our self-actualization and identity, community. That's a whole other thing, but that's there too. It's a special case of unsustainability because to be in fashion is to be new. Fashion, some of the very early literature on fashion describes it as change and as newness. And if the industry requires constant change and constant newness, then it's inherently unsustainable. And so the very early discourses on sustainability in fashion literature, I would say, from what I understand it, like in the early 2000s, but of course it would have been going on much longer. But in my popular knowledge of it, there was a lot of debate about whether the word sustainable fashion was an oxymoron and whether it couldn't exist. But then I think, so maybe, for example, I have a book that was published in 2008 that was really about that. But then I think you like flash back or flash forward 10 years later, 2018, like everything was branded with sustainable fashion, and it just became part of the marketing. It stopped being critiqued. It stopped being questioned of whether it was good or bad. And maybe that questioning at the start delayed it happening longer, similar to like climate denialists or stuff like that. It just pushes the narrative nowhere. So maybe that critique didn't help, but I think a critique to what sustainability is, it was right to happen. I mean, obviously still happens too, but yeah, I think just the way it got adopted into the industry, I feel in a kind of marketing sense. I think that's why it's a special case of unsustainable. And then I think it's a special case of ethics, because humans make clothes. So not only do humans wear clothes, humans make them too. And it's one of the very few industries that, obviously I'm only a fashion researcher, so I'm going to say everything special about it, but I think it's one of the very few industries that is still hugely dependent on man labor. And now that I'm thinking about it, of course, agriculture is too. But to come back to my point, fashion is still a cottage industry. It's still the same sewing machine that has been used for hundreds of years. And although we have had innovation, it hasn't been innovation directed at helping laborers. It's been innovation directed at surveying them or making them move fast as machines. It's been innovation in many other areas except labor rights.
A lot to get into there. What I was also wondering, what is the role of fashion in colonialism, also in in maybe more traditional ways of dressing, and what I'm not sure if you have anything to share about that in the context of Australia. What is the role of fashion in civilizing indigenous peoples and so on?
Yeah, it sounds like you know, but I'm sure what is the case in many colonized countries, but I know it did happen in Australia. Yeah, First Nations Indigenous Australians were given clothes to wear as part of that colonization process. Yeah. And not only given clothes to wear, but also treated differently for not wearing them, and those other things that come with opposing expected dress. Yeah.
And I have a lecturer called Emma Kidd. She has a background in fashion, and she basically got into this whole, or got aware of this whole global situation through working in the global south and seeing the horrendous conditions there. I was also wondering if you could share anything on the rate of human rights abuses or forced labor or something like that in this industry. Yeah.
I am not a modern slavery researcher, so I won't pretend to give a proper statistic, but I was recently in Bath at a modern slavery conference, and it wasn't fashion specific. It did have a focus on products. I think that's often where modern slavery research goes, is into the supply chains and the products that come out of forced labor. And one of the academics said, if you haven't found forced labor in your supply chain, you're not looking hard enough. Basically, it's everywhere. All different levels of forced labor, and that includes child labor as well, and many other awful things. But from what I understand, it's pretty much everywhere. And I think a long time, maybe around this, maybe I can use that book, the Sustainable Fashion book from 2008. In there was also a lot of discourse around more expensive items being better. But I think what we have realized, or maybe what the circle around me has realized, is that often luxury brands are no better than cheaper brands. You'd like to assume they are, and I'm not going to blanket say all, it's more complicated than good or bad, but I just think there are serious labor abuses in every supply chain, and I'm very into brands who say that they don't have that, or any way that they can assure it, if it's not a full supply chain that happens in their backyard or in places that they really can keep an eye on. But then also you don't want to be keeping an eye on absolutely every laborer in the world, because that also is a form of surveillance. And yeah.
What just came to mind, there's a course in our college that explores, what's the name? Fabric making, textile making, through actually growing the plants and then like following the process and actually making them by hand. And I also was wondering, we quite a lot also explore the role of a globalized economy and what the power of local is in, for example, in fashion, because a big part of it is that I just go to, let's say, H&M, and I see all these cheap products, and they're marketed in a very of course, positive way. So if I see the product, I don't see the history of the product, and that would just be if I would get my clothes from a near village in Switzerland, and the conditions would be like that, it would just not work. It's like the globalized economy makes this possible because we're just alienated from where the products go that we produce, but also alienated from where the products come from that we produce. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on local and yeah.
Yeah, I think the local question is interesting. And I can give the case of Australia, which I think is a good case study for this. So because it's an island, we have a good case study for supply chains, really, because we're easily cut off. And so in the early 2000s, some huge tax reforms meant that it became cheaper for clothing companies to import clothing and then sell it in Australia versus manufacturing it here. And this was happening all around the world in kind of a general decline on local manufacturing and more global manufacturing. So it wasn't necessarily Australia specific, but I just know this context. So we have had a history of clothing manufacturing, but we don't really have a lot here now. But we do have a lot of cotton growing. We're one of the highest producers of cotton in the world. And so what will happen is like cotton will be grown here and sent overseas, and we have no textile spinning facility at all. But physically cannot be spun in Australia. And so even for something to be Australian made, or I'm not even really sure what that means, because it can't be complete here. Like a supply chain couldn't be complete here. So sorry, I'm losing my track of thought a little bit, but yeah, we were talking about place and localism. So yeah, there's that thing of, okay, we could all say, yeah, let's all, not just personally, but as an industry, let's call reshoring or right shoring, like bring the skills back home kind of thing. And even if more brands wanted to manufacture in Australia, they would find it very hard to do that so quickly, not only because we don't have the facilities, but we don't really have the skills. We don't have the people able to do it here. And of course, the main reason it is done overseas is because our labor would be a much higher price. So yeah, I think that even though there's something really also funny about fashion and being local and global, like every garment is so local to your body, but it has like one country listed on the back, which hardly reflects every country it would have come through to get to you. So this is really, even in one garment, you could see how it's both intimate to your body, to your home, to your wardrobe, to your community, to your culture, to the globe, to a particular manufacturing country. Yeah, it's very complex.
I really like that. And it's also just, for now, this is only possible in a fossil fuel based society where on the one hand, there's the ethical issue you talked about, that I talked about, in the fact that a globalized economy makes you not realize what horrible things have been committed for your product or whatever. But also the resilience aspect, that fossil fuels are not sustainable and climate change will disrupt quite a lot of areas in our lives. And so it basically seems to be on many levels necessary in one way to focus on resilience again. And that means that there is probably not that huge of a radius in which you could, in theory, sustain yourself for the basic necessities. And yeah, you did also research in degrowth, and connected to degrowth, and I'd also be curious to hear about the connection of what we just talked about and colonialism and so on to degrowth, and if you could give a small introduction to degrowth in fashion. And yeah.
Okay, so I wouldn't say I have many answers around the question of degrowth and fashion, because honestly, at this stage, I'm not too sure what it looks like. But I'm very committed to this idea of degrowth and what it means. I just feel like I haven't quite landed on what it would mean for fashion properly. And it's something I hope to study more, and that I hope the industry is able to realize. So I'm not sure that I have specific answers fashion related, except for the more obvious ones, like we're all going to have to get used to having less clothes. So that's an obvious one. And I think that as a starter has enough implications as a thought bubble okay, if we're all getting used to wearing less clothes, that means there's less clothes being made, which, yeah, that's part of degrowth. It also means there's less jobs available in clothing production. And so a good example of this is during COVID, when a lot of fashion brands had their orders cancelled. So they cancelled their orders, their upcoming orders for clothing, the factories. Because of that, a lot of millions of textile workers were laid off, not given jobs, forced into even more precarious situations in the midst of a global pandemic. And it just showed that there's the idea to just stop buying clothes instantly isn't necessarily the answer either on this mass scale, not without what the industry is calling now a just transition. So moving from state A to state B in a just way and facilitating jobs and security and a better outcome for everyone. It's the term that's come out of the mining industry, I believe, for coal workers. And I've heard being applied in fashion, but I'm sure is applied around in other areas too. So I think that's so degrowth maybe on a personal level is changing your relationship to clothing. On that more industrial scale, it's going somehow, these are the questions I have, is somehow find a system of fashion that doesn't mean newness and doesn't mean change. Or it means those things in other ways. Maybe, and it's going to mean more repair and more remanufacturing. And so maybe there'll be more jobs in that. So it's about that transition from A to B. But I still think it's going to mean businesses need to go out of business. And there's going to have to be less clothes on the market, which means there's going to have to be less fashion brands. There's going to be less fashion weeks. There's going to be less kind of commercial income that surrounds that kind of global north side of the supply chain. Yeah, I think if fashion and degrowth worked, it would also change our relationship to social media and
100%.
to professional dressing and everything. I just think it would have so many more implications than we really realize, because clothing is so ordinary and so a part of us and our everyday. So yeah, and really the only solutions I can think of at the moment are more regulatory ones and pretty harsh ones too. The idea of stopping someone from buying clothes, it feels pretty, I don't know, I just think clothing consumption has been in such a privatized space. It's something that's done individually. The idea of putting a public regulation on that, I think a lot of people would struggle with that.
Yeah, no, that's definitely many things to go in there. What came up for me also, you already mentioned it a little bit, that there also needs to be definitely a cultural shift towards clothing, and you mentioned repair. And I'm from Bern, from Switzerland, and I would say, especially in upper middle class families, people that go to high school, it's pretty trendy to have vintage clothing and to look like you don't spend a lot of money on clothes in a way. And it's quite interesting that it is really an upper middle class thing, because many people that have a migratory background, it's somewhat of a privilege to have this desire to look like you don't have money. And I also find it interesting. I just remember when I went to high school, I often, like, my backpack didn't work anymore. So I used I don't know, like a weird bag to school, and had my books in there always. And my teacher said I can't take it anymore to school because it's offensive, or it's unprofessional and so on. I feel like it's definitely changing. I also remember from my previous uni, my professor mentioned that he had a small beard, and he said that even 15 years ago that would be absolutely unacceptable. There's a different understanding what it means to be professional. It's not necessarily, definitely there's a looks aspect to it, but it's much less that's my experience, maybe also from my bubble. I'd be really curious to hear, will it become socially acceptable to wear stained clothes or clothes with holes, or just things like that?
Yeah, there are actually some pretty cool, radical, sustainable fashion academics who I wish I could give more specifics, but who theorized this idea of having stains and stuff. And of course we see rips and this like aged aesthetic in fashion, in new fashion all the time. You get, for example, like ripped jeans. Think of how common they are. And I'm sure there was a time in history where they were not like seen as a good thing. So that's just one kind of common example. But then the same thing in secondhand clothing, like being seen to be wearing a used garment, also in my bubble, is seen as a good thing. And you touched beautifully on the point about class and privilege there. And for example, I was speaking to a colleague just last week about how I had worn the same outfit many times in a row that same week to all different occasions. And she said, yeah, like that's good for you, but if I did that, I would look homeless. And I thought, okay, yeah, like there's different things going on here. It's also because I don't have babies who spill things on me and am a pretty standard size, so I fit fairly easily into clothing. And yeah, there's a whole different matter of privilege that comes with wearing used garments, as you've mentioned, which is different to how it's been seen in the past, for sure. Yeah. And then the final point about professional dressing, I just think professional dressing is a little bit wacky. And I think post-COVID, that has changed to the more casual professional wear, wearing sweatpants outside of the home. I think a lot of change. Actually, I know there's one Australian denim company that actually ended up closing the business, not necessarily just because of this, but because it was just less demand for denim. And even though denim, when it was first around, it was definitely not like professional wear. Maybe in Australia it was, but there's just less people wearing jeans, or they're buying it. Everyone I know who wears jeans, including myself, will buy it secondhand. So we're gonna see these changes, and in that way, it is a kind of trend and a kind of maybe secondhand clothing is how fashion will still be known as change and still be known as newness. It's just a different type of new, maybe.
And also, there's quite a lot of clothes swapping in Bern, like in informal clothes swapping. And if you don't have to buy new clothes to have different clothes, you know what I mean? I find that also quite interesting. I just also remembered that we had a chat about Nike TNs in Barcelona. I'd be curious also to see how, so there's these Nike shoes called Nike TNs, and they're quite stigmatized, I would say, in different parts of the world. In Bern, actually not that much. They have quite of an alternative vibe to them, but it's definitely, I'd be curious to hear, like, I know you have them and you wear them sometimes, and what they signify in Australia and in fashion in general.
Yeah, this is a funny case study. I don't think it's necessarily connected to degrowth at all, but actually it would be connected to place. So one thing about fashion is all the subcultures that are a part of it. And there are many subcultures, for example, like punk is a good example, who create their own identity based off the fact that they want to be different. They want to oppose the norm. And I think a lot of style tribes and subcultures do this. So punk is just one example that everyone can picture something to. But that kind of style and aesthetic can also come through specific products. And I'm trying to think of a more popular example and a more positive one, but I can give you some negative ones later. But the Nike TNs, they're, I think, all around the globe, fairly understood as a really cool. Like, first of all, Nike would have just produced them because they're cool, or they look cool. But then they get adopted by different cultures and different subcultures, and they're worn in different ways. They're posted about in different ways. They're rapped about in songs in different ways. And then more specific style tribes start to form around specific products. And I think the Nike TNs in Australia have really come around this identity called an esche. And I feel embarrassed talking about this on this podcast because it's such a funny thing for me to be talking about. And I want to put this in a positive light, but basically a really cool, often young, usually men who also wear the Adidas bum bag. They have their socks pulled up a bit. They have little shorts. Maybe they're wearing like a tracksuit, top and bottom, but they have the TNs. And in Australia, being called an esche, I would say, is like a slur. Yeah, but I think they would be proud to be esches. I'm not sure really. Anyway, I bought a pair of TNs because I was actually teaching my undergrad students about style, tribes and cultures and stuff. And I was just pretty fascinated by the fact that one shoe could take on this whole identity. And so I bought a pair and then I wore them on the bus one day, and this guy came up to me and he creeped me out a little bit, and I was like, oh my gosh. And he was asking me about my shoes, and also I should add, people get jumped. And do you know what that means? Jumped? Is that like that's not just Australian. People get jumped for their TNs. So I was a little bit nervous when this guy came up to me on the bus, but and then I didn't wear them in public for a while because I was like, what have I gotten myself into? I am accidentally showing something that's a little bit too much, and I don't want to hurt over silly things. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I bought the shoes. And I actually have 2 pairs now, and I'm very proudly wear them.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna have a bit of conviction to wear them, I think. But yeah, I think it's interesting that then around the world, I think they have this really alternative, cool fashion hottie to them. But in Australia, it's really delinquent vibes.
Yeah,
for sure.
that's quite interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I have a few more topics I'd like to go into. I'm not sure if you can talk to that one, but it just came up when we talked about globalized economy and automation and so on. Could you share anything about AI and fashion? How that will, what are the predicted impacts of that, especially when talking about just transitions?
Yeah, I would say there's probably more impacts than I could be able to rattle off right now. I know when first AI was starting to be talked about a couple of years ago, it was really pitched as this thing that's going to save fashion, and it's going to save fashion. And it said the kind of narrative was, or the logic was, that it would create less waste because people would buy things digitally instead of things. So, for example, they would just edit, or I don't really know how it works, but buy the t-shirt online, post the photo on Instagram wearing it, but then they don't actually have to have the material thing. And in theory, that works, sure. There's a lot of people out there who buy something just to post about it on Instagram and then will resell it or something like that. So in theory, then the way we're engaging with that product via social media is the same. There's no actual need for that person to really have that product, except for the fact that humans need clothes, and we wear clothes and we enjoy clothes. And also, I think since the past couple of years, this idea of wearing digital clothing has just fizzled out. It doesn't seem that interesting to me. People have stopped about it. So I'm not really too sure on that. And I think this logic that it would have created less waste is silly, I think, for 2 reasons. One, because it ignores the fact that we still need to wear clothes. And 2, because if you're posting something on social media, even if it is a digital thing, often it's for the case of selling the product. So, for example, you could say fashion influencers could only buy digital products, but then are they just selling other digital products, or are they encouraging the real consumption of that product? Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, it's a bit weird. I don't quite get the digitalization part, but the AI technology part is interesting. And I think where I can see that could have application now for degrowth stuff is, I think AI technology could really streamline buying processes for fashion workers. So people who work as fashion buyers. And so that means that it would help them, one, monitor their stock, and so that there's no kind of things that are getting lost out of the stock. If you can keep an eye on what you've got, there's no pre-consumer waste getting, just before it even gets to the consumer, it's destroyed or something. You could streamline that. You could make sure that you're not over ordering in the first place. And in theory, if you have better AI understanding of what your consumer is going to buy, then you should, in theory, have no waste in that pre-consumer process. And that is something I think could be implemented straight away. Like we should have been doing that years. Yeah, I think there are other ways that I've seen technology being used in fashion. For example, if you could take a photo of something that has a little rip in it, and the AI could tell you how best to repair it, or you show different little customizations without having to fully commit to the action first. It could teach you different things, could show you different styling techniques. Who knows? There could be all sorts of other kind of more user, at the point of the user, and where there could be innovations there. But I definitely think the stock and inventory control and supply chain management, logistics, all of that
Mhm.
can be helped streamlined by AI.
And probably also just the production could be automated in a way. And I wonder with all the things you've just said, it's a question of who benefits. Like AI is, it's not values neutral, but it can be used to make a business more profitable, or it can be used to increase the customer or the worker conditions. And yeah, that's of course a
At the
big
moment,
topic.
I would say at the moment AI is pitched to benefit the brand. And even though AI said that thing, it could help waste in the end if there's less over ordering. But in the end, that is a benefit for the brand. That's really the main.
That's concerning. It's probably in all of the branches like that. Yeah. You mentioned degrowth again, and I wondered if maybe for an ending, I'd be really curious to hear your experience. Maybe you can share a little bit about your experience in Barcelona and the 3-week summer school we did there, and maybe also inspirations for your future work that you've gotten there, or in general, what plans you, yeah.
Yeah, we had the best time in Barcelona. I feel like I learned so much. And even as someone who went into that knowing a little bit about it, I think what Barcelona really opened up for me was an understanding of this problem outside of fashion. Like I really have only learned about the climate crisis properly in a deep and studied way is via the fashion industry because of research. So yeah, it just made me realize that even more things are fucked up, not just fashion. It pulled me out of that bubble a little bit, which was awesome. And yeah, it made me see the bigger picture a little bit. And it also made me consider a lot this question of what a good life is. And I think you and I spoke about this, and what I keep coming back to is something our professor said about there being countries in the world who are living, I'm going to talk about another economic term, but the donut economics thing. There are already countries who are living in this donut. And so it's not the case that we need to do anything that radical, I don't think. I think that there will need to be radical changes, but it's not like it's impossible or that it's not happening or that we haven't lived in a sustainable way before. So I think it made me realize that there are lifestyles that are degrowth and that can give us some answers that already exist. So that's something I keep thinking about. For example, Professor mentioned Costa Rica as one place that is living within the donut, apparently. And so now all I can think about is just moving to Costa Rica. So hopefully that's in the future. Yeah, I think it made me question a lot as well. It made me consider a lot about how far we are able to travel. And I remember one of our friends at the course, he had made the decision to not use planes anymore. And he lived in the UK, so he could train many places. But as someone from Australia, if I only used planes, I would never leave the country. Sorry, if I only used trains, I would never leave the country. Honestly, I could hardly get to the next capital city in Australia. So it made me really think about transportation a lot more and city development a lot more and what that makes people available to. Yeah, and then so my degrowth stuff for the future, also what I realized about degrowth that I want to center in my future research, and I think I brought this up to the professor one day, and I said, feminists have been saying this for years. This questioning of neoliberal economics isn't new, and it's not some radical new thought thing at all. Actually, there have been feminists who have saying we should celebrate diversity, we need to think about others, prioritize the environment, not think of ourselves as rational consuming beings as a first priority, but think of ourselves as global citizens who have a responsibility to others, who perform care labor as much and in equal value to as we perform monetary labor for money. So I think centering this reminder that this isn't new, I think helps me a lot to realize that there's other stuff we can draw from. And it gets it out of the space of academics a little bit, even though I'm coming at it from feminist literature. But this idea of degrowth started with men talking about it in France. But actually, that's just the term of degrowth that started then. These ideas have actually come from all around the world, from all different genders, from all different studies, and they're just culminating in this theory of degrowth. So I think going forward, I want to center that reminder that this isn't new. Humans have gotten through it a lot before. Yeah. And I often come to this question of what am I going to care about in 2050, apparently, when we're in a net zero or net positive world? What will humans care about if we finally get over this? I think it could be a whole new era of human flourishing and of design, and a whole paradigmatic shift in the way we live and relate to each other and relate to things. Yeah, imagine if our minds were freed from this existential crisis. I feel like I would have so much to offer.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you said. I also really appreciated in the school that we've taken seriously, not just in a way that they should be represented, but we've taken seriously other ways of knowing. We've mostly looked at Western knowledge, but we've also looked at indigenous knowledge to a certain extent. And I really appreciated that because it is the University Autónoma Barcelona. That's a very conventional university, and that's possible in such a setting is pretty amazing. Also, just that in my opinion, there was quite little homework in a way. There was not that much coursework to be done, but I feel like the course had, like on most of the participants, even if they mostly came to the summer school to have a good time in Barcelona, it had quite an impact on their worldview. Also, just because of the fact that we had discussions that were academic, but that were also very open. One could share his personal experiences, one could share his emotions. And we've also, I would say almost half of the days, we went out into the city and looked at concrete projects, or we had a lecture in a super block or something like that. And yeah, just the power of also somewhat of a I didn't feel like Claudio almost never gave a lecture. He taught us, but he mostly facilitated, and lots of the content also came from us, and it was more of an exploration rather than him telling us, okay, that's how it works. It was also clear that what we're talking about here is like it's an emerging field. It's it's always changing, and yeah, it was quite inspirational also from a way of teaching view. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think there was a pedagogical difference in the way he spoke to us, and he came to us and he said, I don't have the answers. He said, I didn't get the feeling that I know he doesn't know necessarily. It wasn't that he was teaching us something that has happened. He was exploring it with us. And I also, we taught him some things, and our conversations helped him progress. And even the fact that he sat in that circle with us on the same level as us, like we're on the same level, you're all teaching each other, you're all listening, all learning from each other too. It was a very democratic space to learn. And what you said actually just reminded me, I have this book here, Audre Lorde, Feminist. Her book or her essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And she writes about, actually, I'm pretty sure in the context of teaching as well, that the institutions that have created the oppression, universities included, and this logic of teacher-student hierarchies, young people feel like they can't speak up for new things. That is the master's tools. And so using that and using the classroom against capitalism and the role between education and capitalism is interesting. But I think, it's finding those little pockets of disruption. And then you're right. In the context of the university, it was a really interesting and rewarding space. Yeah.
Because also there are definitely other spaces like that, but they don't have the academic. You're not getting taught by a PhD. You're getting taught by an amateur, which has its value, but that you combine this scientific and more embodied and reversal approach, I think it's amazing. And just also we had this seminar in my previous university where it was called Cultural History of Climate Change, and it was a lot of discussion, and it just was evident just because of the fact that we're a younger generation growing up with this fear of climate change, that this teacher-student role didn't make sense at all. There were several moments in the seminar where there was real conflict, real conversation between the teacher and the student, in a not normal way, because it just didn't, the teacher felt protective of his role, because it was pretty clear that we all equally had to learn equally from each other, and he is not the one lecturing, which I found really interesting. And just in general, the conventional school setting and university setting, it is industrial. The origin of it is creating workers, and in my opinion, it is partially designed to disempower you, to make you obedient, to basically destroy your revolutionary and creative impulses. And I just think there's huge potential, and it's because we need the academic aspect in it too. I'm just really curious how that will. I'm sure there will have to be huge changes in especially higher education, in all forms of education, but especially higher education, when that it just doesn't make sense at all anymore to sit passively in a lecture. And there's a role for that, but there's also a role for much more empowered ways of learning. And
it comes down to this, what you said about creating workers. And what if we had a system that created activists instead? People were empowered to change the system and to change via the work that they did. Change.
It was I'd have many more things I could go into, but I also want to respect your time. So thanks a lot, Paige. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So nice to talk to you.